I have passed the ball to you, so please go ahead and start.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Joanna, and thank you everyone for attending the session. I haven't done a virtual session like this before, so it'll be my first time using these sorts of tools and these kind of things, but I think it should go straightforward, so if there are any issues, that would be why. To get a better sense of each of your backgrounds, I was wondering, like, obviously it would take far too long for each of you to introduce yourselves, but if you could share a word or two in the chat window to describe yourself, that would be great. For example, if you're a parent, or if you have kids, or anything that gives me a better indication of a bit about your background, and it'll be useful for me when kind of interjecting examples into the presentation. So if all of you would be willing to do that, that would be great.
So we've got myself, I'm a parent of a 17-year-old boy. Stephanie works with children under 12 years. Michelle runs an after-school activity program for elementary school children, so this is right up her alley. Carlene is a mom to a 22-month-old, and she is also military family service coordinator in Washington, D.C., so she will be working with youth who are living in the U.S. Barb is a parent of 4 older kids, but she's got some grandkids starting to come. And she also is the regional manager for our U.S. families living in the U.S. And Jen is a parent of 2 girls. Her oldest is 8 years and has already experienced bullying in school, which is just sad. And she also works with our U.S. families in Rome, New York as the military family service coordinator. And finally, Tammy is parent of a 10 and a 20-year-old, and she is working with our remote families posted to the U.S. And so I don't see for Natasha, if you put one in, I don't see that one. You might have put it to Dr. Holfeld privately.
So great. That's a lot of diversity in the group for this session, which is nice. So I think a lot of what we'll talk about will apply to each of you either in your personal or professional lives. So I just wanted to give a brief outline of kind of what you should expect during the presentation today, or the things we'll talk about. So first off, we'll talk about the role of technology. Without technology, there wouldn't be cyberbullying. We'll run through scenarios and examine what cyberbullying looks like or what it doesn't look like. Also, what makes a situation cyberbullying, and recognizing cyberbullying is the first step in being able to actually respond in these situations. We'll look at how we would describe cyberbullying, and it's interesting to note that our ideas of what cyberbullying looks like actually aligns pretty well with children and adolescents' perceptions, and we'll explore kind of some of that dynamic. We'll look at how common cyberbullying is, how it relates to traditional forms of bullying, and also how it differs from traditional forms of bullying. We will look at how victims respond to their experiences. So what do adolescents do in these situations? And are there certain responses that are especially helpful for them? We'll talk about the impact of cyberbullying. It can be very distressing for many children and adolescents who experience it. And lastly, we'll talk about the role of bystanders. So what happened when youth witness cyberbullying? And the final thing we'll get to is some tips for preventing and responding cyberbullying for both teens and parents. And to make the presentation a little more engaging, I'll be asking questions throughout the presentation. I'm using some of the various tools that Joanna talked about initially. It'll mostly be the tools of raising your hand and the yes and no. So it'll be fairly straightforward. And I'll also be showing some videos to emphasize some of the key points that we talk about. And if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to interrupt me. I'd rather you not wait till the very end because then you could forget your question. So if you have a question at any point, just raise your hand or write the question directly into the chat window. Sound good? Perfect. So the first place to start would be to discuss the role of technology. So out of curiosity, how many of you own a cell phone? So yes, so all of you own a cell phone, not surprising. How many of you go online daily? So most of you, again. So because all of you have access to technology and actually use it, all of you would also be susceptible to cyberbullying. So even though most of the discussion today is going to be focused on cyberbullying that kids experience, it does also apply to parents. So parents are sometimes involved in cyberbullying, either as the individual who helps to cyberbully others, or they sometimes experience victimization. Okay. So many children and adolescents have access to technology, and it's becoming more and more common among younger children. It's impossible not to see a kid walking down the street who isn't staring at their cell phone or on their iPod or something like that. Technology is such a big aspect of everyone's lives, not just kids. But children and adolescents are also spending more time online than ever before. The largest increase in technology use appears to be between grades 6 and 7. Social networking sites are becoming extremely popular. For example, Facebook has about 1 billion active users at this point. And just a quick note, Facebook is starting to become less popular among adolescents specifically, primarily because adults are starting to infiltrate these networks. So kids are starting to move away from this and go on Twitter and Instagram and other networking sites. Many kids suggest that they cannot survive without their technological devices. And I ask this question in schools when I give these presentations, and I'm curious if I ask this question to you guys, how many of you think you would have no problems going 1 week without the internet or cell phones? Yes or no? How many think they can go a week without the internet or cell phone? So kind of about split. If you're bored sometime, it would be an interesting challenge for you to do that. Surprisingly, when I ask students, many of them, or the majority of them, suggest that they can go a week without technology. That is very surprising to me because personally, I don't think I could go a week without using my cell phone or going online. So I've kind of challenged some students to engage in this activity when if they would like to try it out. I assume many of them haven't, but it would be nice to see if they actually can do it. Most youth are using technology in responsible ways, but of course there are some that don't. One of the most negative uses of this technology in the last decade is cyberbullying, which obviously we're going to focus on today. So I thought a good place to start would be looking at some hypothetical scenarios and examine whether you guys perceive them to be cyberbullying or not. So we'll kind of run through each of them and just have a brief discussion about what you guys believe in regard to whether it is cyberbullying or not and why. So the first example, a student with a cell phone records another student undressing. He sends the video to others in class as a joke. How many of you would think that situation cyberbullying? Okay, so majority of you would suggest that's cyberbullying. The next question would be why? Anyone willing to offer any thoughts on why it may be cyberbullying?
Just raise your hand if you'd like to share your thoughts on that.
Okay, Jen, would you like to share why you think that's cyberbullying?
I would think that that is a private situation and that there would be no consent given to share that information. So, yeah, I would think that that would be bullying.
Great. Likely the situation that the student who has the video taken of themselves wouldn't want that sent to others, wouldn't want that posted anywhere because it's a personal situation. So we would tend to classify this situation as cyberbullying. What's interesting though is when I pose this example to students, most of them would think it's cyberbullying, but this last part of the example as a joke, if that last part as a joke is in there, a lot of them would suggest it's not cyberbullying. So if the student who took the video of the other student was only doing it as a joke, then it's not that big of a deal. It's a little interesting that kids have this perception that if it's only a joke, if they're only joking, then it shouldn't affect the other student. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that may be the case later. Okay, so how about the second example? A student sends a mean email to another student in class, causing the student to feel upset. Is that cyberbullying? Okay, why would you consider that to be cyberbullying? Michelle?
I would say because the intention is to hurt and to violate the other student.
Okay, perfect. And intent is a key aspect of cyberbullying that we're going to talk about too. But one tricky issue with intent is it could be difficult to infer whether someone was intentionally trying to be mean to another student. As you see with this first example, was it intentional even though they meant it as a joke? So just something to think about. And the last example, two girls, formerly good friends, have a falling out over a boy. One girl, knowing the other girl's Facebook name and password, goes online and posts mean comments about the other that should read girl in the class. Do you think that's cyberbullying? And why for that situation? Anybody want to offer any thoughts on why that might be cyberbullying or why not? So with this situation, or Barb, you want to offer?
Oh, I mean, in all of these cases, and this one as well, it is all meant to hurt the other person. So it's going about it in ways that's the ultimate goal, is to make fun of or hurt the other person.
Mm-hmm. Good. And with this example, we see that the intent is more deliberate and more obvious in this case. There was something that happened between the girls. So the one girl is deliberately doing this behind the other's back to hurt them. Okay. And how about this situation? So Mark writes on Facebook to another classmate that we are going to get you after school. Would that be considered cyberbullying? Why or why not?
That would be cyberbullying because it's made to inflict fear.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Tammy says in the chat box that it sounds like they're making a threat.
Okay, good. And Michelle, you had a comment?
I was going to say yes, the same thing. It's a thread. It's not like it's a conversation between two people. It's a one-sided statement with the intention to create fear and the feeling of powerlessness.
Okay, good. And that piece of the power issue is something that's important. How about in this situation? So we're going to get you after school and then puts a smiley face at the end of the message. Does that change anything if there's a smiley face at the end of the message? Exact same sentence, but there's only a slight modification. What do you guys think? Do you guys think that situation's cyberbullying?
I would say definitely the perception changes just by those few little characters.
Okay, do others agree with Joanna? So many of you kind of went back and forth on whether you think it's cyberbullying or not, which is interesting because kids tend to have the same reaction. And this goes along with the previous example where the person said just joking at the end. This relates strongly with that situation. So does the message of it being a potential threat change if the person puts a smiley face at the end? Again, something to consider. And the last example, the exact same message, but this time it's all in uppercase and has multiple exclamation marks. So how does that change the perception of the message? Would this situation be cyberbullying?
I think it's difficult to know with this sentence, Dr. Holfeld, because what if it just means they're picking you up? Like we're coming to get you after school. I think it's a tough one.
And that's a good point, and that it goes along with the kind of the issue of the online world where it's really difficult to know the intent of someone's message. And kids are pretty smart. So if they think that it's less of a deal, it's not as serious if they put just joking or put a smiley face after, and potentially they're going to be in less trouble, then they're going to do that. Okay? So I just wanted to run through some of these examples to give you a sense of how situations can look very different and how the message and how the message is written can also have an impact on the individual's perceptions. So your perception as someone who received the message or your perception as a bystander in the situation. Okay, so next we're going to talk about how we as researchers would describe cyberbullying. So we would describe it as an aggressive, intentional act carried out by a group or individual using electronic forms of contact repeatedly and over time against a victim who cannot easily defend him or herself. So the key elements in here, which we talked about a few of them, would be aggression or an aggressive act, intentional, has to occur repeatedly and over time, and then the last part of the sentence, against a victim who cannot easily defend him or herself. So this gets at that imbalance of power between the victim and bully. And that imbalance of power can look very different in the online world. So there's some obvious issues to consider when we're talking about how these elements work in the online world. So what would constitute repetition? Would a message have to be sent repeatedly to another student to be repetition? Or is repetition satisfied if the message was sent and posted online so that everyone can see it. And we saw some of the issues with intent. It is very difficult to infer the sender's intent of the message, even if they put at the end that they're only joking or put a smiley face. The intent can differ from the receiver's perspective versus the sender's perspective. There are many different types and mediums of cyberbullying. We're not going to talk too much about these. We saw in the example with the Facebook situation with the two girls, that would be considered impersonation, and that would be a type of cyberbullying. One that's drawn more attention in the media would be sexting, so sending nude or partially nude pictures to others, which that situation can have very severe legal consequences. And we're not going to talk too much about the legal consequences of cyberbullying, but everyone should be aware that there are some consequences. Question, Jen?
My question is in regards to the cannot easily defend him or herself.
Mm-hmm.
How do they explain that to define how one defends themselves against that? Because you can easily, in a Facebook message, somebody puts something in, and do you consider defending yourself as, well, that's not true, as your response, or how do they define that?
Good question. There's definitely some debate about how that can look online. Some have suggested that the victim may have less expertise with technology and therefore may not have the skills to effectively defend themselves. Or it could be that if there's lots of people involved in a certain post or video or picture that's posted online, even though you're defending yourselves, if everyone else is making comments that are along with the bully's comments, the initial instigator, then you could feel like there's nothing you could do. You could start to feel helpless because you get the sense that everyone's against you. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Yes. So I put check mark. Sorry.
Okay,
yes, that's perfect. Thanks.
I saw the check. Thanks. And again, there's lots of different mediums. It can be done through email, social networking sites, chat rooms, discussion forums, text messages. So there's so many different ways it can be done, and it's so many different ways that it could look like, as we saw with some of the examples. Each situation is very unique and can look very different. So it can be a very difficult topic to study, and part of the reason why a lot of people don't have a good understanding of what cyberbullying is because there are virtually an endless number of situations. So next, we're going to talk about how common it is. So we already talked about what situations may look like and how we would describe the behaviors. The next place to talk would be to be focusing on how common it is. So we do know it's a global issue. It affects kids and adults all over the world. It's not exclusive to North America. In fact, most of the research that's being conducted is being conducted outside of North America. There's actually very little research being conducted in Canada, which is a little surprising considering how much attention is starting to be drawn to the topic. We know that affects both genders, so it affects both boys and girls, and we know there's no racial or ethnic differences. So kids from every different background can be impacted by cyberbullying. When do you guys think cyberbullying would be most common? What grades do you think cyberbullying would be most common? Feel free to write in the chat box, or you could just verbally tell me what you think.
Stephanie's got from 6 to 7. Michelle has from 4 to 6. And I assume you mean grades for that?
Grades, yeah.
Yep. And grade 5, Jen says. Barb says teenagers.
I'm surprised a lot of you are suggesting very younger age groups.
4 to 10, yeah.
Cyberbullying, the research would suggest that cyberbullying peaks during the middle school years. So it's most common during grades 7 and 8, and then starts to decline around high school. But from some of my recent research, we're finding that it actually is pretty common among elementary school grades. So it is common among grade 5 and 6 students. And we haven't looked at grade 4's students, but I would suggest that it probably is fairly common among that age group as well. So it's a little concerning that these behaviors are starting to affect younger and younger age groups. Not surprisingly, these age groups are gaining greater exposure to technology at these younger ages, which is a significant risk factor for cyberbullying. What would you think about in terms of how many kids do you think are involved in cyberbullying? So what percentage of kids do you think experience cyberbullying? Feel free to put your guess in the chat window. 75, 60%. Any other guesses? 50%? So it sounds like most of you think it's much more common than it is. I'm not discounting the fact it is common, but the research would suggest that 1 in 4 kids have experienced cyberbullying at some point in their lives. And that number is probably a little higher than that. So it's probably a little higher than 25%, but researchers and what you see in different papers that are published is the researchers have measured the behavior in so many different ways that it's tough to compare their findings across studies. But conservatively, I would suggest that about 1 in 4 kids have experienced cyberbullying. We know there's a lot of overlap with traditional forms of bullying, especially relational forms. So relational bullying is spreading rumors, gossip, those kinds of things. Victims of traditional bullying are more likely to report cyber victimization. So this is why a lot of times you hear people talk about that cyberbullying is just an extension of traditional bullying. The bullies may use this new medium to continue their harassment of others, and it may be perceived as an easier way to kind of engage in these types of behaviors. Rates of cyberbullying are actually still lower than rates of traditional bullying, despite some of the media and news stories suggesting otherwise. So cyberbullying is becoming more problematic for kids, and there's greater awareness over the behavior, but it's still not as common as traditional bullying. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, moving on. So we know cyberbullying is very similar to traditional forms of bullying, but we also know it's very unique. And the main way it's different involves the use of technology to bully. Again, without technology, cyberbullying wouldn't be an issue. The behavior can be potentially anonymous. One issue schools are dealing with in the last few years are kids going on these anonymous posting websites and cyberbullying others in these environments. So they don't have to post their identity. They could post they could post their message without saying who they are. And it can be very difficult for schools to track down and identify each of the kids that are involved in these situations. What a lot of kids don't understand is your identity can always be traced back to your IP address. So even if you post in these anonymous posting websites and don't give your name, your comment and your post can always be traced back. They can always find out who wrote the message. So when I tell kids this at school, it's interesting because I get a lot of surprised looks on kids' faces. So a lot of them don't seem to be aware that even if you don't have to give your name when you post a message, that they could still find out who wrote the message. So kids definitely need to be aware of this, and adults as well. There's a virtually unlimited audience online. This is a key distinction between cyber and traditional bullying. With traditional bullying, only those who are around in a given situation can witness or participate. But with cyberbullying, the same situation can be recorded via video and posted online for others to see. And anyone in your class can see it, anyone across the country, and virtually anywhere in the world could see it, depending where you post the video or information. It's very difficult to escape with traditional bullying. It typically occurs at school, but once you go home, you can escape the abuse. But with cyberbullying, the home is no longer safe. Messages, pictures, videos can be sent at any time of the day or night. It doesn't matter if you turn off your cell phone or computer, the messages can still continue. So in a lot of ways, that's why cyberbullying can be considered a more distressing form of bullying than traditional forms. Much less supervision online. There's no real cyber police. Yes, you can report offensive material, but there's no one tracking each comment you are making. For example, adults are less likely to supervise what their children are doing online in social networking sites or elsewhere. So in a lot of ways, someone who likes to engage in these sorts of behavior may view it as a much easier and more convenient medium to do so. The problem is you may be more willing to say or do something online that you wouldn't normally do in a face-to-face situation because you don't have to see the other person. It's much easier to be mean to someone online where you don't have to see them than it is in a face-to-face situation. And this can be problematic because the message you send and post, you may want to take it back after when you realize that I shouldn't have said that. But once it's posted, it's too late. Even if you delete it later, the remnants of that message are still somewhere in the online world where people can retrieve it. And there's this sentiment of if you write that you're just joking around, it's no big deal, that you shouldn't be blamed and there'll be no problems. And we kind of discussed that a bit before. But what does that really mean? Are kids writing that message to avoid being blamed? Do they realize that the harm they're potentially causing to the person who receives the message? There definitely seems to be this separation between what the sender's perception is versus the receiver. So one point I always emphasize to students when I give these presentations is that you should think before you post. It's so easy to write something and click submit or post or send like that. But if they spend just a couple seconds thinking about whether they really want to send that message, it can make a huge difference. Because again, once you post that message, there's no going back. So next, I want to show a video that kind of depicts nicely some of the things we have just talked about. So if you would like to get that video going, Joanna, that would be great.
I will. So everybody, I'm just going to be sharing a quick video. I just ask that once I hit play, you don't unmute yourself and don't touch the screen so that we all stay together. When we come back from the video, if you could all give me a green check just to let me know that you are finished watching the video and we can start talking again. So it'll be loading in just a second. And just remember to give us a green check when you're back. Dr. Holfeld, I had a quick question about this slide.
Sure.
On that point about it's difficult to escape, your home is no longer a safe place. Do you think that's why, even though cyberbullying is still not as common as traditional bullying, that we're seeing so many more suicides and attempted suicides, and it's becoming such a hot topic in the news because of that? Because it's like you can never escape it. Has there ever been any correlation with that?
Good question. There's definitely, this is one of the reasons why people view it as a more distressing form of bullying, because it's so much harder to escape. Again, leaving school doesn't help alleviate the situation. To go home, being home doesn't alleviate the situation. There's been some research to show that cyberbullying, or the experience of cyberbullying, is related to suicidal thoughts. But there's been nothing to suggest that cyberbullying, or the experience of cyberbullying, is a cause of suicide. A lot of times, kids who experience cyberbullying, especially if it's chronic, are also experiencing traditional forms of bullying, and they likely have a lot of other things going on. So suicide can be a kind of final outcome, so to speak, in certain situations, but I would be hesitant to say that cyberbullying is a cause of suicide. It can definitely be a contributing factor, and I'll show another video later that kind of shows how it can be a factor, and has been a factor in certain situations where kids have experienced cyberbullying.
Thank you.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about how individuals respond to their experiences. So most kids are told that if you're involved in bullying, involved in cyberbullying, you should tell someone about it. Not surprisingly, many kids choose not to tell anyone about it. Why do you think kids may be reluctant to tell parents about their experience with cyberbullying? Anyone have any thoughts? Want to raise their hand?
It's embarrassing.
It's embarrassing, yeah. Barb? Barb, you have a thought?
Yep, I was just muted. they may be concerned that they're going to get cut off of their technology if the parents feel that that's, you know, getting too close to things. So they may have to give that whole piece up or a significant part of it.
Hmm. And that's a really good one. And I see Jen kind of wrote that same point, that a lot of times kids think that the parents are going to take away their computer or cell phone privileges. One of the big problems this can cause is that indirectly blames the child for the experience. So they experience cyberbullying, they're telling you about it, and you take away their technology. So you're telling them that it's their fault for what happened. And we'll kind of explore why, or some other options parents can do in those situations. Sometimes kids think parents will overreact, or they don't think they can help. May not think that parents understand the technology enough to help them, or may not know what cyberbullying actually is. So what about to teachers? Why might kids be reluctant to tell teachers about the experience? Any thoughts? Carlene?
Part of it might be they just don't want to be called out in class, so they don't want other kids to know that they're being bullied, and that might work as well.
Mm-hmm. Good point. They may be scared or reluctant to tell teachers because they don't want others finding out. They may think that teachers don't have the knowledge to help them. Carlene? Do you have
Sorry, I just didn't take it off.
Okay. And one of the other reasons is that kids think that teachers won't be able to help if it occurs off school grounds. Many kids don't understand that schools have a responsibility to address the situation in school if it is affecting the child in school. And I try to emphasize that message to students, that even if it occurs off school grounds, if it's affecting you at school, then teachers have a responsibility to help you. So it would be wise to tell them if you need help to resolve the situation. Okay. And Joanna, you had a comment?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think a lot of kids still don't want to be viewed as snitches.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I've experienced that in the past, where kids, even though they were the victim, still didn't want to tell because they were afraid that they would be viewed as a snitch.
Mm-hmm. And that's definitely one of the reasons. It tends to be less common, but it is. We have heard that is one of the reasons that kids may not want to share their experience. Yeah. So what do kids do then if they don't tell someone about their experience? How do they respond? So these next few slides are taken from some of my research, where we looked at how victims responded to their experience and whether the response actually helped them to deal with the situation. So we created these categories based on the most common responses, which we'll see in the next slide. So passive responses, so ignoring it or doing nothing. Active responses, reporting it or telling someone. Or reactive responses, confronting the bully and getting revenge. Which response do you think is best? Anyone have any thoughts? Want to raise their hand? Barb?
Personally, I like the revenge part, but I suspect active, the second one is most likely the right one.
I like the honesty, and it's funny that you say that, because when I ask this question to students at schools, they'll say that active is the best way to respond, but they'll also acknowledge that most of them will likely not respond in that way. most of them will respond reactively to that situation.
Yeah.
So they're definitely aware of what they should do, but a lot of them don't do it. And it's a bit of a trick question, to be honest, because there's not one best response in all situations. Passive responses tend to be best for more minor forms of cyberbullying, such as if you received a harassing email message. But active strategies are generally needed for more serious forms of cyberbullying, such as if you received embarrassing pictures or videos, or when the behavior persists for a longer period of time. We also know that reactive, almost 100% of the time, if you respond reactively, it's going to make the situation worse. Okay. So in this slide, we asked middle school students in grades 7 and 8 to recall their most recent experience with cyberbullying, and we asked them how they first responded to the experience. So this is how we kind of made the groups that you saw in the previous slide. So if you see at the bottom, the doing nothing, trying to ignore it, those are the passive responses that are very common. And then you see the active responses in the middle, telling an adult at home, at school, and telling a friend. If you add those up, they're a very frequent response. And then just above that, confronting the person and getting revenge are the reactive responses, which are also very common. And what you may also notice is there's so many different ways kids respond to their experience, mainly because there's so many different ways it can occur. So that's why it's difficult, and everyone always asks, what's the best way to respond to cyberbullying? It's tough for me to give a definitive answer because the situations look different in every situation. Okay. Any questions on this or surprises at this point? Okay, I'll move along. So what was more interesting to me is not just how victims respond, but does it actually help them to deal with the situation? And what is key is that if you respond a certain way, it can help you to reduce the cyberbullying, but it may not help you to feel better. So it may not reduce the level of distress. And the opposite could occur. You could respond in a certain way that makes you feel better, but it may not reduce the cyberbullying. So we looked at whether the response was effective in reducing cyberbullying and also in reducing the distress, and looked at these separately. And I won't get into too much of the statistics behind how we examine this, but basically what we found was making a joke was more effective, perceived more effective than any other responses. And passive responses were viewed as the least helpful. So the doing nothing or trying to ignore it were perceived as the least helpful responses. Anyone have any guesses why making a joke could be effective in these situations? Carlene?
I think because the intent is to hurt the person. So if they're making a joke about it, then it's showing that it didn't bother them or hurt them, so they're hoping that it won't happen again, that the bullies will stop.
Mm-hmm. And that's perfect. So if you make a joke, it shows that it doesn't bother you and can help divert the bully's attention elsewhere. Look, it may not work in every situation, but the pattern we kind of find is if you make a joke as a first response in these situations, it can be very effective. And we also found that telling someone was not always helpful. And adults were not more effective than friends at helping a victim to resolve their experience. What was most disconcerting is that victims who told either a friend or adult were only helped about half the time. So about 50% of the time, the victim who told either a friend or an adult or both parties receive the help they need to reduce the cyberbullying and reduce the distress. And to me, that's very disconcerting that we're encouraging youth to share their experience when they're involved in cyberbullying. But when they come forward, if we're not helping them, why would they want to share their experience in the future? Joanna?
Yeah, do we know why that is? Is it just that we don't know the solutions, and so we're not sure what to tell people when they come to us, or we just don't think it's that big of a deal? Any thoughts on why that's not happening? The help isn't happening?
Well, we're currently trying to, we asked victims about the advice either friends or adults gave them when they experienced cyberbullying, and we're still kind of trying to sort through that data. A lot of times kids didn't really tell us what these individuals told them, so they didn't tell us how friends responded or how adults responded. So it's a little tricky to figure out kind of why they're not getting the help. But I would definitely suggest that, or I wouldn't be surprised if we find that both friends and adults don't really know how to help them. And a lot of parents have admitted that to me, that they don't really know enough about technology to effectively help kids. Teachers have said the same thing to me, and if they're not in a good position to help them, it's likely that their friends are feeling the same way. Okay. Any questions at this point? Okay, great. So moving along. Next, I want to talk about the impact of cyberbullying. And in addition to the things we'll talk about, I want to show you a couple videos. It does a better job kind of identifying the impact or showing you what the impact of cyberbullying can be than me just talking about it. So Joanna, if you want to get the next video going.
All right, everybody, so just sort of the same deal. Just make sure your microphone is muted and don't touch the screen once I started the video. And it should, oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
With this video, it kind of talks about situations of 3 adolescents who were cyberbullied and kind of talks about their experience and what happened for them, and we'll talk a little bit more about that after the video.
Thank you, everybody. So I'm just going to go ahead and start it. Don't touch the screen and give me a green check when you return after watching it. Thank you. Just give us a green check when you're back. All right, looks like everyone's back.
Perfect. So that video talks about the stories of 3 teens who ended up taking their own lives, and one of the contributing factors in all of the situations was cyberbullying. Like I said earlier, a lot of times each of these children have other things going on in their lives, but cyberbullying definitely a factor. The situation with Megan Meyer was actually the first major cyberbullying case that was discussed, and that one actually involved a parent who was helping to cyberbully her. So adults can have a role in cyberbullying as well, positive or negative. So cyberbullying can be very devastating because of the 24/7 nature of the online world. As we talked about, the home is no longer safe. The harassment can continue even if you turn off your cell phone or computer. And the material can stay online for a long period of time and can be very difficult to remove. The impact can vary based on the duration and severity of the experience. Generally, situations that last longer and are more serious are more distressing. But a lot of times, even a short duration or a situation where it was only one post or one picture posted can have very strong negative impacts. What can make the situation more serious? Any thoughts? Hands or chat? So what do you guys think can make a situation more serious? Joanna?
Well, I would think just the words that are being used. I mean, if someone's just like, you're stupid, or, you know, I don't like you, might not have quite the same impact as you need to go kill yourself, you're hideous. Like, so I think just the words themselves just that are being used could impact that.
For sure. And situations are very serious if a direct threat is involved. Those will make it more serious. Jen?
I think too, if it's everywhere, like if it's on Facebook and it's on Twitter and it's everywhere they go, then it becomes, an unescapable situation.
For sure. If it's going on through multiple mediums, so Twitter, Instagram, social networking, etc., it can be very serious and much more distressing for the victim because it makes it that much harder for them to escape the abuse. Not all adolescents report feeling affected by their experience, but the ones that do often report symptoms of depression, anxiety, reduced self-esteem, may experience suicidal ideation, decreased quality of life. At school, they may experience poor attendance, poor performance, and may not want to go to school. They may also feel sad, angry, upset, frustrated, or helpless as a result of the experience. And these effects can affect both kids who are experience cyber victimization and those who engage in bullying others. Partly because we know that the relationship between cyberbullying and cyber victimization is cyclical. So what that means if you're a victim of cyberbullying, you're more likely to cyberbully others, and if you cyberbully others, you're more likely to be a victim. So sometimes victims are unable to reduce the distress on their own, so they may need the help of others, such as bystanders. So just before we get to the role bystanders may play in these situations, I have one more video to show you about the impact of cyberbullying. And it's a nice touch because it includes a common and relatable form of media that kids are aware of, which you'll see shortly. So Joanna, if you would like to play that video.
All right, same rules, everybody, and then just remember to give us a green check when we're back.
So with this,
Go ahead.
sorry, with this video, obviously a little more, I guess, graphic in the sense that you really get a sense of how kids are feeling when you could see them in a face-to-face situation telling them where they describe how they're feeling, which is very different. You can't get that sense on the online world because you can't see them. Any questions, comments about those videos? Joanna?
When we were talking, you had mentioned, what is the reaction when you show that video to kids when you do this presentation for kids?
With that last video, what I tend to get is a lot of kids will laugh through the first half of that. So obviously they think these comments are funny, and for those that laugh, they probably would either engage in the behavior directly or support those who are engaging the behavior. So that's part of the issue, that kids just think it's funny. It's a joke, it's not a big deal. Whereas the person who receives the message, which you could directly see in that video, we have a different perception entirely of that experience. Okay. So next we're going to talk about the role of bystanders, because many victims may not be able to resolve the situation on their own. They may feel like there's nothing they can do, they may feel helpless, and they may need the help of others who witness or are around in this situation. So how many of you have witnessed cyberbullying? Yes or no? So not surprising that many of you haven't witnessed cyberbullying. Cyberbullying is much more difficult for adults to detect. But if we ask kids this question, the majority indicate that they have seen cyberbullying occur, and the percentage is somewhere around 85%. So in the online world, there's a virtually unlimited audience. You may see a video, you may see a picture, you may see a post, you may have no idea who that person is, but you do have a role in preventing or maintaining the behavior. You can be an active bystander, so you could actively join in on the bullying, or you could intervene on the victim's behalf, so you could have a negative or positive impact. Or you could have a passive role where you just watch it and do nothing. And I love this quote: by doing nothing, bystanders are doing something. What that means is, if you're doing nothing, if you're only sitting there watching it go on, you're encouraging the bully and telling them that their behavior is acceptable. So you're reinforcing the child's behavior and that what they're doing is acceptable, even if you like the comment that they made. That tells them that it's what they're doing is funny. So bystanders could have a very important role in cyberbullying. So in one study that I just conducted, I'll briefly run through it and kind of what we found. What we're most interested in is whether bystander perceptions of the victim varied based on how the victim responded in the situation. So, for example, do bystanders view victims differently if the victim responds passively? So if they try to ignore the behavior, versus if they respond actively, where they tell someone about it, or reactively, where they confront the person. So this is the scenario we made up and gave to each middle school student. So an example on Facebook, and in the example, we didn't want to allude to cyberbullying at all. We kind of wanted to make it somewhat ambiguous, but we wanted to make it clear that the person who received the message was clearly being affected by it. And regardless how they responded, if they responded passively, actively, or reactively, it didn't matter. The hurtful comments were still being posted. So the only thing we manipulated in this situation was this text in black. So how the victim responded. So either it was, I tried to ignore it, or I told someone about it, or I confronted the person. And we wanted to see how this influenced bystanders' perception. So bystanders rated how much responsibility, control, and blame they had for the victim. And each participant only read one scenario. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, great. So what we found was passive responses, so when the victim responded by trying to ignore it or doing nothing, elicited stronger perceptions of control, responsibility, and blame than active or reactive responses. So bystanders were less likely to help these victims in these situations. So bystanders may perceive that it's not, maybe the situation is not that serious or not a big deal if the victim is only trying to ignore it. Or maybe it's very serious if they had to tell someone about it. Alternatively, they may think that victims who respond actively or reactively are trying harder to deal with the situation than victims who respond passively. So these victims would be perceived as less culpable for their mistreatment. What this told us was that some victims of cyberbullying may not be considered true victims. The problem is, without any visual clues in the online world, how can you identify who is in need of help? Anyone have any thoughts? So online, how can you identify who needs help? Any thoughts?
That's tough. It's tough, but I would say anybody who you see is being barraged by what we would consider bullying, I think needs help, whether they are acting passively, actively, or reactively. We can still reach out to them and try to stop it or speak out on their behalf.
Mm-hmm. Good. And Barb?
Well, I think it comes down to making sure that there is talk about this, so it becomes the new normal and provides the opportunity for kids to be able to share stuff that that if it's never kind of talked about in the open, it's just like sex, right? I mean, if it's not talked about, everybody keeps their mouth shut. But if it's part of the ongoing conversation in your home or in your environment with kids, then you're more likely to have them share that.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the reasons I like to include scenarios in these presentations with students or with adults is so we have a better understanding of what cyberbullying looks like. So we know what cyberbullying looks like. We each have our own idea what it looks like. So that should help elicit you to respond in certain ways if you see it. Sometimes there'll be situations where the victim directly says that they need help. So in those situations, it may be easy to identify who needs help. But most of the time, that won't be the case. Jen?
This is a little bit of a backtrack to your last slide about, well, I guess it'd be this too, bystanders. So I was bullied as a kid for about 6 years throughout school. Thankfully, we didn't have technology, so to speak, back then. But my bullying started because I had stuck up for a friend of mine who was being bullied, and I brought it to the attention. How do we protect those kids who don't remain bystanders?
That's a very good question, and one I don't have a very clear answer for you, to be honest. We would like to think because in the online world there's more bystanders present, we would think that there'd be more that would be active in trying to help the victim, but we actually find the opposite. So even though there's more people that can see it, they're less likely to participate, and that could be part of the reason that they fear retribution or repercussion from the individuals that are engaging the behavior. And I don't know, it's something to think about. How can we encourage more kids to be active bystanders in a positive way without endangering them?
Yeah, I don't know. I struggle with that a lot, especially having 2 children of my own. I don't want them to be bystanders and allow people to be cruel to others, but at the same token, I don't want them to have target written on them either. So
yeah, and I think the biggest thing with that is if we, as Barb suggested, if we change the conversation, create this idea that these online communities, you should be an active bystander. If more people have that mindset, then it'll be a safer situation for individuals to help others. But currently, I don't think that is the norm.
No, I agree.
People don't have those prevailing attitudes, so that could be one of the first places to start, that we should address those social norms and social attitudes of engaging in pro-social ways. And I think we should do that for kids in face-to-face situations too. Granted, I wouldn't advocate that for all situations because obviously individuals could have different weapons in a face-to-face situation, but modeling appropriate face-to-face behavior helps kids to understand what that behavior should look like online.
I have another question too. With your research, have you found that with the more public situations, do you find that schools are actually addressing this, or are they still struggling to find their place in how their role plays to fixing this or helping kids deal with this?
Good question. And I do have some issues with some schools. To be honest, there are some schools who are great, who kind of want to learn more about cyberbullying so they are in a better position to help their students. if they're involved, but there are other schools and other teachers and administrators where they're content with the fact that they're adopted and implemented a bullying intervention program that other colleagues may have used, but have no idea whether it actually helps addressing the situation in their school.
Right.
They're happy just doing the bare minimum that, well, we're mandated to have a bullying prevention program, so we have one, and we're good. So
Yeah.
in my experiences, some of these schools are really not doing a great job in dealing with it and addressing to an ever-changing behavior and way in which kids are communicating, positive or negative. Technology is not going away. There's a lot of positive benefits for it, but again, as we talked about, there's lots of negative to it if kids don't understand what appropriate online behavior is. So schools, I'm very surprised schools aren't more active in trying to figure out and deal with the situation, because they are always dealing with the situation. The last 3 presentations I gave at schools in Victoria, and I gave one back, I'm formerly from Winnipeg, so I gave one in Winnipeg when I was visiting a couple weeks ago. In all of those presentations, when I talked to the vice principal, each of those schools were currently dealing with a situation involving cyberbullying.
Yeah, it's everywhere, and I'm shocked. In our particular location in Rome, New York, I'm still in shock that there are not more things going on in the schools to address cyber and traditional bullying, especially since every child seems to have a cell phone in high school. Yeah. It's really frustrating.
I agree. It's a lot of this, a lot of the prevention, intervention stuff really needs to begin at a much younger age. Traditional bullying experiences begin in elementary school, and we're starting to see the same with cyberbullying. So it starts, the education and teaching kids about technology and how to use it appropriately begins at home, but also has to occur at school too. So it's not a problem that's exclusive to just schools. It's a problem within the community and a problem within an individual's environments. So the kind of the take-home message from this study was that as a bystander, you need to recognize that some victims may need help regardless of the context or characteristics of the situation. So it shouldn't matter how they respond. It shouldn't matter what their social status is. None of those things should be factors. So you shouldn't post negative comments just because others are doing it, and obviously you shouldn't forward the materials for others to see. Okay, and next I want to show you a final video based on an excerpt from a TV show, What Would You Do? It's on ABC. The show depicts certain situations and basically tries to see how people would react in different situations. So this video is very interesting because it depicts a cyberbullying situation involving a group of young girls in a restaurant/coffee house situation, and it looks at how others who hear the situation going on, how they respond to it. So Joanna, if you would like to play the last video.
All right, everybody, so just keep yourselves muted and give us a green check when you're back. Just give me a green check on your back. Ugh, painful to watch.
So the last couple things I'm going to go through is some final tips for prevention and responding to cyberbullying from the perspective of parents as well as teens. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because a lot of it we already talked about. And I realize the presentation is getting kind of long, but cyberbullying is a topic that I could talk about for hours and days, so I apologize. So,
you're okay.
So for teens, some good prevention efforts are educating yourself. This is one of the reasons why I like to give presentations at schools so that kids have a better understanding of what cyberbullying looks like and how they can respond if they're involved directly as a victim or as a bystander. Shouldn't share their online passwords. Cyberbullying is not anonymous. The majority of cyberbullying occurs within social circles, which a lot of people may not realize. So a lot of times you could share your online password with a friend, you could have a falling out with that friend, the next week they could use that password against you. Be cautious types of pictures you post online. Obviously, people can use those pictures in different ways against you. Think before you post, we talked about that. Use privacy control. There's privacy control available in many social networking sites. You could limit the number of people or who looks at your profile. Always log out of your online accounts. If you leave it open, obviously someone who is next on the computer can use that information against you. Google yourself. You should always Google your name, kids or adults. I do it. I still Google my name. You always want to know what's online about you, positive or negative. If there's stuff online that shouldn't be there, you want to find ways to delete the information. And this includes Googling your name under Google Images. So if any of you haven't done that before, I would suggest you do that. And last, don't cyberbully others. We know that if you cyberbully others, you're more likely to experience cyber victimization. If you're a victim, you're more likely to cyberbully others. So it tends to be this cyclical relationship. Responding, the big one here is saving the evidence. Easy to take a picture with your smartphone or take a screenshot on the computer of the exact situation. Once you have this information, it's easier to deal with the situation and work with schools to alleviate the problem, especially before the kid or before the individual deletes the website or posting. Ignoring it can be helpful with more minor forms of cyberbullying. Telling someone generally always recommended, especially when the situation is more serious. But a caveat with this, we also have to educate ourselves so we're in a better position to help individuals who are involved in cyberbullying. Don't retaliate. The majority of the time, it's going to make the situation worse. Laughing it off, making a joke can be very effective. Again, we talked about it can help to divert the bully's attention elsewhere. Blocking the person can be helpful. It really depends on how the cyberbullying is occurring. It may not be an option in many situations. Reporting it online, a lot of websites, especially social networking sites, you can post offensive material, pictures or videos directly online. And finally, call the police, especially in situations where a direct threat is involved. Okay, and some tips for parents in preventing cyberbullying. So you should model appropriate face-to-face behavior, because in many situations, kids will think that if it's okay to behave in a certain way in a face-to-face situation, it's okay to behave that same way online. Should be aware of the warning signs of cyberbullying. A lot of these warning signs are kind of general warning signs if you think something's going on with your child. But there are some specific ones, such as if your child is becoming or becomes withdrawn after using their cell phone or computer, feels like they're afraid or don't want to go to school, and things like this. So any atypical behavior, especially atypical involving the use of technology, would be warning signs. Online education is key. An example I always like to use is when you're teaching your child to ride a bike, you don't just give them the bike and expect them to learn how to ride it. So why should it be any different with technology? We have to teach them how to use the technology responsibly and in an appropriate manner. We shouldn't just give them the technology, because otherwise, how do we think they're going to learn how to engage in appropriate behavior online? Modeling with technology, again, you shouldn't engage in certain behaviors with technology that's not appropriate. So texting when you're driving, for example, kids, if they see this, they think this is an appropriate behavior, and kids, as you know, see much more than you realize. Supervision monitoring, some of the research is a little inconsistent here in terms of whether this actually helps. And you can do this through filtering software. What seems to be more effective is if you develop open lines of communication with your child about what they're doing online. So you don't have to necessarily supervise and monitor exactly what they're doing online, but if you have open lines of communication with them, then they're going to be more likely to tell you about something they're experiencing online that's positive or negative. Okay. And finally, some tips for responding to cyberbullying. Collect evidence, key, we talked about. Listen to your child without judgment. So we talked about you shouldn't take away their cell phone or computer privileges if they tell you that they were a victim of cyberbullying. Do not contact parents of the other child. In some situations, it can make it worse. The parent of the other child may think that what their child did was acceptable and just a joke, it's no big deal. So it may not be helpful in some situations. You should work with the school to deal with the problem. Cyberbullying is a problem for the student, not just at school, but within the community. So you really have to work with the school to kind of effectively address the situation. Contact internet service provider. Contact police if threats are involved. Explore counseling opportunities if necessary. You can help them to reduce the cyberbullying, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to feel better from the experience. So they may need the help of a counselor to help them to work out the distress they're experiencing. And finally, don't ban access to technology. We just kind of mentioned that. By doing that, you're blaming the child for what happened. And I know I kind of ran quickly through the prevention and response tips, but again, a lot of that we already covered throughout the presentation. So that is all I have for you guys. Does anyone have any final questions, comments? Joanna?
I'm just curious, when it comes to reporting to the police, has that proven to be effective? Are the police equipped to investigate cyberbullying?
I couldn't say for certainty that all police are, but I know a lot of police units are receiving training on dealing with these online situations. So they're starting to become more equipped and more prepared to deal with the situations, especially school resource officers, for example, who have a more direct impact or more direct involvement in these situations.
Great.
Any other questions, comments? Barb?
Mine is just a comment that I just want to thank you for giving up your time to be on this session. I think it's a great great presentation, and certainly begins that conversation that needs to get started all over the place. So I just really want to thank you for putting the time and effort into this, and I would hope that as a recorded session, we're going to get a lot of hits on it after the people who are here are able to talk it up out in their communities. So thank you very much for that. It's been great.
You're welcome. And that's part of the reason I like to reach out to different organizations and talk in the community, talk with students, talk with parents, talk with others, is to start to create that conversation. Because I know the research very well, and I think the information I have can be very helpful for a lot of people who are looking to gain this information. So I'm hopeful it's valuable for most people.
I think the more knowledge we have, the more power we have. You know, we don't feel so helpless when someone comes to us, you know, expressing their concerns or experiencing it themselves. At least we have a reference point now, you know, to understand, you know, why kids might act the way they do, what they might perceive it is, what they don't perceive it is. So, yeah, this is a great starting point, Dr. Holfeld. Does anybody else have any questions for Dr. Holfeld before we wrap up our session today? You can give them a big round of applause with your applause emoticons if you don't have any questions. And I just ask before you leave today that in the chat box there's a SurveyMonkey survey link. If you would just take just a couple of minutes, it should take you less than 5 minutes to fill out our survey. It is anonymous, and it just helps give us feedback for continued virtual programming for our community. So thank you so much, Dr. Holfeld. Thank you very much. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. And if you want to X out, you just close your browser. If you're on a PC, that's the red check in your upper right-hand corner. If you're on an Apple, it's in the upper left-hand corner, and you just close your browser. All right, thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Dr. Holfeld, thank you so much. I'll be sending you a follow-up email and giving you the feedback from the surveys as well, okay?
Perfect. Thanks a lot.
Appreciate your time so much. Of course, anytime. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay.
All right, bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.